Oh, hey there. Welcome back to The Binger. Today, we thought we'd get a little nostalgic and take a look back at some of our favorite Nickelodeon cartoons. But more than that, we're going to be going over how some of our iconic favorites looked and sounded so different before they were changed to the ones we know and love today. Some of these changes are so drastic, you've got to see it to believe it. Now, we can't start off a video like this with anything other than SpongeBob. The insanely popular show has been airing for over 20 years now, and seems to be the only cartoon that fans just never grow out of. If you're with SpongeBob, you're with him for life. But that might not have been the case if it weren't for some pretty major changes made to the character early on. SpongeBob creator and total genius Steven Hillenburg didn't always work in the cartoon industry, far from it. He was actually an educator at the famous California Ocean Institute. In order to help kids learn about the deep sea, he created a comic strip called the Intertidal Zone comic, which featured a little sponge who would eventually become world famous. Only this sponge was a lot more like the real-life sea sponges that live in the ocean. First of all, he was circular, and secondly, he definitely didn't wear pants or a tie. Eventually, Hillenburg went on to work for the other Nick classic, Rocko's Modern Life, where he stayed for years. That experience led him to develop his comic further, and eventually turn it into the pilot for a TV cartoon featuring that same sponge called Sponge Boy. It wasn't until later that Sponge Boy became SpongeBob, and even later that he was given clothes. They actually added his outfit to the character in order to make him appear more innocent and childlike. Before it became one of the favorite shows on Nickelodeon, The Loud House was supposed to be different. Very different. So much so that instead of a giant family of humans, the residents of the Loud House were actually supposed to be bunnies. That's right, adorable, fluffy bunnies. In the original concept, the bunnies would act just like humans, but because of certain specific bunny characteristics, there were gonna be a whole lot more of them.
Man, that's a lot of sisters.
Now, we have a hard enough time keeping up with shows like Game of Thrones and Downton Abbey because of the sheer abundance of characters, each with their own unique storyline. Imagine trying to keep up with 22 sisters who all look exactly the same. Even their parents would have struggled with that one. So, luckily, the show was pared down and the bunnies became humans. And yet, in an homage to the original concept, an episode of The Loud House featured a dream sequence in which they all went back to their bunny roots. Rugrats will always have a special place in our hearts as one of the very first Nicktoons that came around and became the catalyst for a whole new wave of amazing cartoons that raised us. And yet, if the show had stayed true to the pilot episode, it might not have become the massive hit that it did, and the absence of one very important character might have just changed everything. Rugrats was created by Arlene Klasky and Gabor Chupo, who had been working at The Simpsons at the time. It's clear that there was some inspiration for Rugrats that they got from their time in Springfield, specifically from the pacifier-addicted Maggie. They created a pilot for their new show, but instead of the entire family, it focused entirely on Tommy and his discovery of what most grown-ups know as the toilet.
I think it's alive.
In this pilot, not only was the logo different, but he also had a slightly different head and has traded his blue shirt for a red one. The biggest difference, however, is the fact that neither Chucky nor Angelica were in the pilot. In fact, Klasky was actually really against including the character in the show, and it wasn't until she was convinced otherwise by her group of writers that the real Rugrats was born. One of the most popular Nickelodeon shows of all time has got to be Invader Zim. The mix of CG and traditional animation was what made the show incredibly unique and visually awesome, but also why it was so expensive to produce. Eventually, the show was cancelled, which was a blow to audiences and the creators alike. It was particularly hard on the mind behind the show, Yonan Vasquez, because of how difficult it had been to get the show on the air. Vasquez got his start as a comic artist before being offered a job in animation at Nickelodeon. They originally wanted to pick up his comic series Squee, but wound up deciding that it would be too dark for a Nick audience. Funnily enough, he turned around and created Zim, which was pretty much just as dark, but was cartoony enough to get by without the higher-ups noticing. This show didn't change so much in terms of looks, but the voice of Zim could have gone in two two totally different directions. Originally, they tested none other than Mark Hamill as the voice of the titular alien. But because Hamill was so well known for voicing the Joker, he sounded a little too grown up for the role. They then tried out Billy West, but because he was already starring as Fry on Futurama, Vasquez thought Zim deserved a voice that didn't belong to anyone else. Finally, Richard Stephen Horvitz was given the part, and Zim, as we know him, came to life.
Their stupid eyes can't handle all this!
Sometimes, even a studio known for creating some of the biggest TV cartoon hits of all time makes a mistake. We're all human after all. And with Planet Sheen, they just never quite figured out how to match the awesomeness of the show they were spinning off from, Jimmy Neutron. The show saw Sheen head off to another planet, mostly populated by dull-witted aliens, monkeys, and other random creatures. One of the major reasons why the show always felt off is because it was never supposed to have anything to do with Jimmy Neutron. Originally, it was called Red Acres and was all about a grown-up astronaut who had crash-landed on an unfamiliar planet. And yet, the executives at Nickelodeon didn't like the idea of an adult being the main character of one of their cartoons, so they just replaced him with Sheen and hoped that that would do the trick. They then added in an alien with a lot of the same characteristics of Carl to fill out the show. After a bunch of different delays, the show finally came out, but it never quite lived up to the Jimmy Neutron heights from which it came, and didn't last long. We can't picture anything other than the Fairly Odd Parents that we know of today, and yet, in an alternate timeline, there's a show that looks and sounds similar, but is actually different in a lot of ways. Originally, the character of Timmy Turner looked really different, with his signature pink hat replaced with blue. And the reason why it was changed from blue to pink is actually kind of funny. See, when drawing Timmy using colored markers, the creator of the show went to pick up his trusty blue marker and found that it had run out of ink. So he switched to pink. They decided to go with it, and the rest was history. Wanda also looked quite different in the beginning as well. She started out as blue, but was changed to pink to prevent her from blending in with the background. Oh, and instead of seeing the whole family as we do on the show, the original idea was to only ever see the parents from the neck down and to keep their faces a mystery. Problems with animation arose, and eventually they were given heads. Hey Arnold is one of those shows that is such a big part of our childhood, and we can't imagine anything else in its place.
Football head!
Hey Arnold!
And yet it took some pretty big changes to make it the show that it is today. Hey Arnold actually came into existence as a small segment in the old Simpsons Illustrated comic books before being picked up to develop into a show of its own. In the strip, we saw Arnold get challenged to a fight by Harold, and in an effort to get out of it, he pretends to be crazy and does a dance number. This story might sound familiar because it's what they used for the pilot episode, and another later one too. Aside from the character designs being a little different in the pilot, from Helga's overall look to Harold sporting a crown instead of his signature baseball cap, Arnold showed up to his fight in a suit and tie, and sang the classic Hello My Baby number that Michigan J. Frog made famous in the Chuck Jones Looney Tunes series.
Hello, my baby. Hello, my honey.
CatDog was one of the weirdest shows Nickelodeon has ever produced, and yet it still managed to become a bit of a cult hit, staying on the air from 1998 all the way to 2005. Brought in to fill the space left by shows like Rocko's Modern Life, the famous half-cat, half-dog creature was originally supposed to look quite different. When trying to figure out the best way to combine a cat and a dog, the creator of the show looked at images of conjoined twins. This led him to a design which saw them first joined at the hip and later as one body with two independent heads. They found that this version made it too hard for the cat and the dog to have distinct personalities and lives of their own, so joining them end to end actually gave them a bit more space to be their own characters. That's not the only change either. CatDog was initially supposed to be a superhero called, and we're serious about this, CatDog Man. They decided that it would be more interesting to see CatDog trying to navigate everyday life instead, so the superhero idea was scrapped. We just wonder how they got the man in there in the first place. Back in the day, 3D animation was still a very new style of animation and cost a ton of money to produce. And yet, as kids' TV shows were moving further from the live-action puppets on giant sets that they had been before, a la Barney or the Teletubbies, the minds at Nickelodeon wanted to give it a try. That's where the Backyardigans came along. Originally created as one of those live-action shows called Me and My Friends, the studio didn't think the pilot was quite what they were looking for. So they scrapped the live-action aspect and made it all in this new style of computer animation. It worked, and the show became a massive hit. Finally, one of the most iconic shows that has ever appeared on Nickelodeon was almost a completely different thing altogether. While Blue's Clues has been a part of our lives for so long that we can't imagine anything else now, it could have been very, very different. So much so that it was originally about an orange cat. That's right, it was first pitched as a show about an orange cat named Mr. Orange, before the studio then decided to make the cat blue and finally to turn him into a dog to avoid similarities to too many other Nick shows at the time. The name of this new show was also supposed to be Blueprints, as a reference to Blue's paw prints, but they just couldn't miss the opportunity for a good rhyme. And Blue's Clues as we know it came to be. It's amazing to think that all of these Nickelodeon classics could have been so different. What do you think about all this new information? Did we miss any major changes that we need to know about? What is your favorite Nicktoon of all time? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button to keep up with all of our latest videos. See you next time.